Okay.
Yeah, thanks, Lee. So, thanks for joining this CTRF seminar today. My name is Brian Lee. I'm a senior lecturer in transport, the School of Built Environment in UNSW, and I'm just here to introduce two presenters today, Dr. Lee Roberts and Dr. Hao Wu. We actually have been working together for a number of active transport research projects focusing on cycling behavior, bikeability modeling, and also cycleway design from the last year. Dr. Roberts has a master's degree in architecture and urban planning and a PhD in urban design. His PhD research focused on the creation of urban rail trails and the role of active transport in public spaces. His main research interest is how public space and active transport can contribute to social and economic vitality in cities. And he'll present us today about his research on cycling infrastructure design for interested but concerned group. And the first presenter, by the way, is Dr. Wu. He joined City Futures in the last year as a research associate, and he got his PhD in civil engineering at the University of Sydney last year. And before that, he studied his master's degree in civil engineering again from the Georgia Tech in the US. So Hao's research focuses on accessibility and related land use planning and travel mode choice areas. And he'll present us today about his study on international comparison of different transport accessibility. So thank you, and please welcome Hao.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
So the title of my presentation today is Urban Access Across the Globe, an international comparison of different transport modes. So in this research, we basically compare different transport modes in different global cities in terms of how well they connect people with their destinations. So the idea behind this research is that for transport system, it doesn't matter how fast you can travel on the roads, but what matters is how easy it is for you to reach your destinations. And this is an international collaboration, and you can see we have many co-authors. When we published this journal last year, we almost ran out of co-authors, we almost ran out of reviewers for our paper. And the metric we use to compare different modes of transport is using access to jobs, which is the cumulative person-weighted access to jobs, and is a performance measure for the ease of reaching desired opportunities. And the reason for using access to jobs is because jobs are urban opportunities. They represent more than just employment opportunities, but jobs also represent urban amenities and services. So staffs at shops, restaurants, schools, and hospitals, these are all represented by job locations. So ideally, more accessible jobs are preferable to less. So if you have maybe 1,000 jobs reachable, and that will be more preferable than having 100 jobs reachable, because you have a higher chance of having a desirable destination in places that are reachable. And this figure shows graphically how accessibility is calculated for this research. So in the figure, we have 3 red dots, which represents job opportunities, and we have 2 concentric circles, which represent the size of the area you can reach within 15 minutes or 30 minutes. So in the green big circle, we can see there are 3 red dots, which means you can reach 3 different opportunities within 30 minutes. So from this figure, you can kind of see the 2 pillars of accessibility, which are transport infrastructure and the land use. So the first pillar is the transport infrastructure. Basically, it determines the size of the area that you can reach within a given travel time. And the land use element determines how many jobs there are in the area that are reachable. So for example, in US cities, they have extensive highway network. So you have a huge area that you can reach within 30 minutes. but the low density land use will mean that there may be very few jobs in the area you can reach. In comparison, if you look at European cities, you may be able to reach a very small area, but the high density would mean there are much more opportunities reachable within that area. So the goal of this research is to look at different cities. And so basically, US and European cities, these are two extreme examples of different approaches that are used to develop urban land use, and how different cities develop their transport system. And in this research, we basically look at which approach is more efficient in connecting people and their destinations. And we also use for each city, we're using person-weighted access. So basically, we compute accessibility for each mesh block and then weight it based on the number of people in each mesh block. So the benefit of using person-weighted access is that it reflects the experience of the average person within a city. So if more people live in more accessible areas, a city will have better accessibility. So it's a better approach than using the simple average of different zones. And the access is also it's not an abstract concept, because it's really related to the livelihood and economic benefit of cities. And access related to property value. So places that are more accessible have higher property value. And access relates also to the mode choice. So ideally, a mode of transport will have more people using it if this mode connects better people with destinations. And these are the reasons why we measure access in different cities across the world, because of its importance for a city. And basically for this research, we covered 117 cities from 16 countries from 6 continents. And from this table, you can see we have cities from Africa, Brazil, Canada, China, Europe, Australia, New Zealand, and lots of cities from the United States. And these cities each adopt a different approach in how they build their transport network and how they combine transport network and land use. So US city mostly it's highly extensive interstate network with very low density land use. European cities and Chinese cities, these have very high density and they build network differently from US cities. And Australian, New Zealand cities and Canadian cities are somewhere in between. So they're similar in US in terms of land use density, but they don't have extensive transport network. So in this research, we'll look at how these different approaches ended up providing different levels of access to people. And for data sources, we have 2 major data sources. The first is number of jobs and population. So these are well documented by census data. And also the benefit of using access jobs is that it provides us with a universal unit of measurement. So $1 US may mean differently in US or in other countries, but one job would mean the same thing in the US and in other countries. So it's a universal unit of measurement that allows us to compare different cities. And the second major data source is travel time between locations. So for each city, we build a large travel time matrix between mesh block to mesh block. And these are based on the roads and pedestrian network from OpenStreetMap. So it's actual distance travel on the network. One notable thing about this research that we included effects of congestions. So we use for public transport, we obtain the digitized transit schedule data from GTFS, which already accounts for the effects of congestion during peak hours. For automobiles, we use a combinations of Google API, TomTom API, and for US cities, we use a combination of APIs and also speed from loop detectors. So the bottom line is that to incorporate the effects of congestion. So bigger cities, they have more jobs, but they also have more severe congestions. So we look at if these cities if bigger cities provide better access than smaller cities. We also include 4 different modes of transport: walking, cycling, transit, public transport, and driving. So for public transport, we include door-to-door travel time, including walking to train stations, time spent transferring, and time spent walking from the destination station to their actual destination. And here are a few hypotheses which we tested in this research. So the first hypothesis is that large cities have mature land use, great number of opportunities, and better transport infrastructure, but they also suffer from more severe congestions compared to smaller cities. So the question is, bigger city and smaller city, which provides better access to people? And the theory is, because people still vote with their feet to bigger cities, the theory is that big cities are still more attractive and have better access than smaller cities, despite the congestion during peak hours. And the second hypothesis is that cities from different worlds or continents have different patterns between their city size and access to jobs. Because US and European cities have adopted very different approaches to their transport systems. So similar sized US and European cities may have different levels of access, and we look at which approach is more efficient in connecting people and places. And the other research question which we seek to address with this research is which is more important for access, density or mobility. So mobility is the distance you can travel, how fast you can travel on the road network, and density is how many number of opportunities are there in the area that you can reach. US cities have very sprawling land use development with intensive road network. European and Chinese cities, these are typically cities with a very long history, and they have compact cities with very extensive road network, but a bit different from US cities. And then Australian, New Zealand, and Canadian cities, they have US-style land use, but without US-style highway network. And we look at these cities, how different accessibility to jobs are in different cities that adopt a different approach to a transport network. Now, if we look at the results, on this figure, we plotted the metropolitan population on the horizontal axis on log scale. And on the vertical scale, on the vertical axis, we have the number of jobs you can reach within 30 minutes, also plotted on log scale. And it's from this figure, as you can see the European cities and Chinese cities, for a city of similar size, the European and Chinese cities have much higher working access compared to the US and also Australian cities. This figure shows cycling access versus regional population. And again, you can see that US cities are doing the worst in terms of cycling access to jobs. And basically, the low density in US cities are taking a heavy toll on the active transport. And one interesting thing is about the Brazilian cities, that the researchers from Brazil basically told us, you can see there are a few cities with high population, but very few reachable jobs. And we were told there is some underground economy going on there. And so some people don't report some jobs. So that's why, although they work, they don't report they have a job. So that's why they have very low working access, cycling access. These are the limitations of data we have. And this kind of figure shows the transit access versus regional population. And again, the European and Chinese cities are doing much better than American cities. And in the last figure is the driving access versus regional population. So the legend has it that US cities are built around automobiles. So it should be that US cities should have the best access by automobile. But from these figures, US cities, indeed, they have pretty decent access to jobs by automobiles. But European and Chinese cities with their density still have much better access than even the American cities. And one interesting point is the Perth here, which is an Australian city, but it kind of deviates away from other Australian cities and resembles much more like a US city. And this figure shows the ratio of the number of jobs reachable by different modes of transport. So if you look at the red boxes, which shows the number of jobs reachable by auto, divided by the number of jobs we can reach by transit. So in US cities, the US cities have some of the most unequitable results from automobile and transit. So if you look at the green box, which shows the number of jobs reachable by cycling divided by the number of jobs reachable by transit, you can see in all cities, cycling can reach more than twice the number of jobs that can be reached by public transport, because basically it's fast moving and it takes waiting time out of the equation. But judging from the number of people who actually ride the bike, it's pretty apparent something is very wrong with the cycling infrastructure. And because we're using basically, when we model cycling, we're basically using our road where cycling is legal, not where cycling is pleasant. So a lot of people may not be willing to risk their lives by riding a bike, although it's much more convenient than public transport. Here we conclude with our findings. The first finding is that despite congestions, large cities provide great access to jobs than small cities. So despite all the complaints we hear about people complaining about congestions, larger cities are still more attractive than smaller cities. So it really does not matter how fast you can drive on the freeway. What matters is how easy it is for you to reach destinations. And in that respect, bigger cities are still more attractive. The second finding is that American cities, despite their legend, they have excellent automobile access to jobs relative to their sizes, but they're taking a heavy toll from their low density, and they lag behind in walking, cycling, and access by public transport. And third finding is that European and Chinese cities, with their density, they have the highest access to job numbers. And the fourth finding, and which is our conclusion, that we don't actually need to choose between density and mobility. If we look at European cities, density and mobility, they can actually coexist to produce great access to jobs. And also with both density and mobility, we can have good access, not just for automobile, but across all modes of transport. That's my presentation. Thank you.
Do we want to do questions?
Sure.
Sorry, I don't know if I'm taking your order. Should we? Yeah, I can just jump in. So, but it'll take me a second to get set up. So.
Sorry, I actually have a question, but maybe I can ask a question after yours, Lee.
Yeah.
Okay.
So far away, I can barely even see that. All right, can everybody online see that okay?
Yes.
Okay, good. Okay, so I should explain a little bit about my background before I start, because it's going to be quite different from Hal's. I have a design background. Practicing architect is where I came from. So much more of a design orientation to this, and much less data and more pictures. So we'll see how that goes. No. Why don't you just can you just hit the arrow key for me and advance slides?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Left and right.
It's not working good.
Let's start again. Maybe this is the downside of having your design person do the tech support. Interesting. I can get it to advance on a little one. Yeah, that works. Can you make it for me?
I'm changing the slides.
I tell you what, while you're working the tech angle, I'll talk a little bit about this project on this slide.
Can I?
Oh, yes, please. It's designing for the top one. Yeah.
That's what they can see.
Great.
Well, without you looking at it.
Good. Can I minimize this? Does that work?
You just want to, yeah, you just want to click through on where the arrow is under the thing there. It's small for us though, I guess.
You could probably,
You
you
can-
could probably make that one bigger,
Yeah.
Make this one bigger.
and then that way you can see it.
Yeah.
It should make.
Yeah, there.
Good.
That's fine.
All right, everyone can still see okay? Where do I click to get the remote control to work?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Good thing we had some extra time. So this is a project that we're currently working on. We're about a third of the way through a 2-year project. This is funded by iMove, CRC, and we're working with the Our City group on campus. I better look up what that stands for, because I always forget. The Research Center for Integrated Transport Innovation, which is on UNSW campus, and Transport for New South Wales is our main client for this. And what we're, oh, you guys can read all my notes, excellent.
I can't see them online.
We can see them, but no one.
Good. So I'm in a pretty small active transport group within City Futures. Hal and I work together with Chris and with Brian and with Mike Harris, who's in landscape architecture. And we're, just because I don't know how many active transport presentations have been in this seminar series in a while, so I thought I'd back up a little bit and just talk about why we're looking at urban cycling to begin with. And I should say, I'm talking about utility cycling, meaning cycling for everyday transportation. So this is not your weekend warriors out on Lycra. I mean, that has obviously a lot of health and sport and social values, but we're looking at it more from a transportation standpoint. You know, people who ride a bike to get from A to B, whether that's commuting to work or to the shops or taking kids to school or that sort of thing. So, so the question is, why look at cycling? Why try to promote cycling in general? And these are probably familiar to most people, so I'll go pretty quickly through them. But obviously there are a lot of health benefits of cycling, both personal health, but then if we scale that up, there's a lot of societal health issues that can be addressed with just being more active in general. And I think the statistic is something like $290 million of direct medical costs in New South Wales is put towards diseases that can be addressed by increasing activity level, whether that's coronary heart disease or adult onset diabetes, those sorts of things. So there's of course individual benefit of health, but there's also a big societal benefit of increased activity. Environmental issue benefits of cycling. It's the most efficient, energy efficient form of transportation. But maybe of this, one of the things that I think is good for us to remember, especially when we're thinking about cities, is that like 40% of our urban land is dedicated towards cars in one way or another, whether that's parking lots or just road space. And if any reduction we have in the number of cars in a city just means that we have that much more land for things that either are good for us on a personal level or are good for the planet, you know, whether that's reduced heat island or impervious surfaces or the amount of road maintenance we need to do, or just more space for landscaping and other uses. And kind of related to that is the livability benefits of increased cycling in cities. I don't know what your experience of COVID has been, but one of the things that I really noticed about the fact that fewer people were driving to work is just that the streets were way more pleasant, just quieter, and just more pleasant to walk on or cycle on. And I think it's if we can take one positive out of COVID, maybe that's it. That our cities really are highly impacted by cars moving around our streets on a daily basis, and it just as soon as we start taking those cars away, that our experience of cities changes dramatically. And if you ever go to any place that's got a car-free downtown or anything like that, you can really experience what that's like to be in places that are where the city is less dominated by cars. Okay, so if that little 5-minute spiel convinced you that we need to increase cycling in cities, then the question is, who do we need to design for? Who's the sort of target demographic in terms of potential cyclists? Because as we all know, there are not that many people who are cycling today. It's 1% to 2% of most trips are by bike. So if we want to increase that number, how do we do that? Who do we need to design for? And this is a framework that maybe people have heard of before. It's called the 4 types of cyclists, and it was developed by a planner in Portland. His name was Roger Geller. Back in the early 2000s, he sort of was trying to think about this question of how do we promote cycling. And he thought, well, in his experience, there were sort of different types of cyclists that had different needs as cycling went. And I'll just go through them briefly. You have a small group of people who are what he called strong and fearless riders, people who will ride anywhere, regardless of whether they're in traffic or not, and are happy to ride in any conditions. Then you've got and that's a pretty small group. Then you've got your enthused but confident riders. Those are people who are still comfortable riding with cars if they need to, but they'll choose safer routes if those are available. And then you've got this big chunk called the interested but concerned. And these are people who like the idea of cycling, or maybe like cycling recreationally, but just don't feel safe riding on a street with cars. And then you've got your final section. You guys probably can't read that, but it's the no way, no how group. These are people that either can't bike for whatever reason, or just are not interested at all, and are going to be it's going to be hard to convince them to change their behavior. So the first question is, who do we need to be designing for this group? Hopefully this works. Yeah. So first, the no way, no how. There are people who just are not interested or can't cycle. So we can look at sort of down the track, how do we encourage those people to change their attitudes towards cycling? But for a group, they're kind of the hardest group to reach in terms of demographics. And your enthused and confident and strong and fearless riders, those are people who ride anyway, today on our current streets. So really they don't necessarily need any new infrastructure or any new accommodation. And it's really this group, the interested but concerned, which is the kind of ideal target demographic, the people we're trying to reach when we design bicycle infrastructure. And you can see now these numbers are from the United States, from a large national survey of 3,000 people across the country. But actually Transport for New South Wales did a very similar study back in the early 2000s and got slightly different numbers, and they used slightly different kind of sorting system, but they came up with pretty similar, like half the population are interested in biking, but don't feel safe riding on the street. So that's really the group that we're trying to target when we design for them. Okay, so this project actually started from this question of if we think we want to address these interested but concerned cyclists, what are the kinds of things we do to try to reach them, to try to accommodate them? And so our research started with Lit Review, and we looked at 23 plans from across basically the English-speaking world, mainly because that's the only language I can read, so that's the only thing I looked at. So we looked at examples all across Australia, most of the capital cities in Australia. Then we looked at some European countries, UK primarily, but also English literature from kind of the cities we always think about with cycling, the Netherlands and Copenhagen. And then we looked at some US cities as well. And Again, what we were looking for were kind of the exemplar cities and the exemplar plans. What's international best practice in terms of bike infrastructure? How do we address these people who are interested but don't currently cycle? And Transport, as our client, part of our role was to look at their current document, which is called the Cycleway Design Toolbox, which they released in 2020, and just kind of do a peer review of that. How does that stack up against best practice internationally? And actually, it was really nice to see that this document is actually rates pretty well in comparison to these other plans from cities that we think of more often than New South Wales as cycling destinations. So when we looked at those plans, so I should back up and say, this is an infrastructure project. So we're looking specifically at bike infrastructure solutions. Of course, promotion of bicycling includes a whole range of other things from land use and urban design and behavior change programs. But when we looked just at infrastructure, there were kind of three big themes that were popping out to us that were pretty consistent across these documents. And they are, these three. The first one is separated bike paths as standard practice. I think most people have seen a separated bike path, whether that's Burke Street in Sydney, or even the pop-ups that have popped up around New South Wales. But it's a bike lane or bike path where there's some sort of vertical barrier between the vehicle lanes and the bike lanes. And this is really considered kind of the gold standard for bike infrastructure. Now, there are a number of ways to do it, but that separation is really what makes the difference between whether people feel generally safe biking or whether they feel at risk when they're biking on cars. We called it separated bike paths as standard practice. Oftentimes these things are sort of the showcase piece where you do one street and it's like, oh, look, we're bike friendly. But really what's key to making a city work for cyclists is to have it be a network of separated or protected paths. And so thinking about separated bike paths as your standard solution as opposed to your exceptional solution is really key to getting a city more bikeable. And I should say separated bike paths are most critical in areas with high volumes or high speeds of motor vehicles, but there are a whole range of streets that don't rise to the level of an arterial or a high-speed road. And so there's another solution, kind of a lower cost, more kind of neighborhood scale solution, which is called a quiet street, which you may have heard of. We've got some pilot projects in New South Wales and examples in Western Australia and some in Victoria of streets where the goal is to create a good cycling environment and actually also a walking environment by slowing down cars and reducing the volume of cars on the street. And really the magic number there is 30 kilometers an hour for speed maximum and 3,000 cars per day. So, in New South Wales, that's a very high bar. We have virtually no streets that match that in terms of a criteria, but there are some great examples in Western Australia and Victoria where they've tested this, but also if you go to the UK or Europe, this is becoming a standard practice in what's called a low traffic neighborhood, where the traffic is slowed down and most cars are directed outside to the edges of the neighborhood, and they do really, there's good evidence that creates not only a good cycling environment, but also a great environment for pedestrians, and also actually even a safer environment for car drivers as well. Okay, so that's number two. The third approach that's kind of like the next step for most places is this idea of a protected intersection. If you think about riding a bike, or actually any form of transportation, it's true for a car as well, it's the intersection where you're most at risk for crashes, right? It's also the place where people feel least confident, especially on a bicycle or something, or as a pedestrian, moving through an intersection can be a stressful experience. And so there are a range of strategies for extending the kind of protection of a separated bike path through the intersection, or at least minimizing the area where you're exposed to cross traffic and potential crashes. And so protected intersections are pretty rare in Australia. There are a couple in Victoria, but they're becoming, there's sort of some Dutch models for how you do this, and they are sort of slowly percolating out to cities around the world. But it is sort of, the intersection is always the hardest part to deal with in a bicycle network. And so it's been slower to have those come up, but they're coming. Okay, so that was pretty much the end of that first segment of our lit review. You know, what do we need to build if we want to accommodate people who are interested in cycling but not confident? The second phase of this project that we're working on right now, and actually how is leading this piece, is okay, if we know what we need to build one of these sorts of solutions, where can councils actually make that happen? So we're developing an Excel tool that will let a council put in some pretty basic information about a street, the current traffic volumes, current speed limits, some other attributes for the street, and then generate a pretty quick calculation of, okay, here's a range of solutions that could work on that particular street. And the idea here is that it's not giving you the one perfect solution for that street, but it's giving you some options that as a traffic planner or as an urban planner you can look at to say, okay, this would work, this won't. And also the idea is that you can go back and forth between that sort of data entry piece and this solutions set and experiment with, oh, what would happen if I took out on-street parking on one side of my street, or I got rid of a clearway, or I made a street one way. You know, what would that open up for us? So it's just designed to be a kind of quick and dirty tool for a planner to use to sort of get the ball rolling in terms of, okay, we know we need a bike path from Green Square to UNSW, for instance. Let's look at some of the streets along the way and try to generate some ideas about how we could create a network there. All right, and then the third question that we're looking at in this project is kind of taking us back a little bit to that first question of, okay, what about the interested but concerned group? And one of the issues, one of the ongoing issues or concerns about the Geller 4 types of cyclist model is the question of, do we really know who these people are? Are we sort of imagining that they belong in one of these 4 categories, but are we sort of over predicting in terms of where people land in that 4 types? So one of the last piece of this project that we're doing, and admittedly kind of the coolest part of this project, is looking at that question of these, you know, how do we make sure we know who we're talking about in these 4 types, and are we designing the right infrastructure for them? And this is where our city is sort of leading the charge. Oh, I'm so sorry, I should back up. The concern about the 4 types of cyclists a lot of times is about how we gather that data. And the way it often works is that we do it by telephone interview. And so we'll ask them questions like this. You know, think about a major urban or suburban street with 4 lanes, on-street parking, traffic speeds of, sorry, this is US, 30 to 35 miles an hour, like 50 kilometers an hour, and no bike lane. How comfortable would you be riding in that street? And then we could say, well, what about if we added a painted bike lane in there? How comfortable would you be now? Oh, what about if we added a separated bike lane with something in between? So it's quite hypothetical, you know. And we're asking people to imagine these streets and imagine whether they're going to feel comfortable on them. And oftentimes they may be the types of streets that they've never actually experienced in person. So it's a little bit hard to know if we're getting good data from questions like this. So we can do kind of the next step and do a visual preference survey or an online survey where we can show them a picture of that type of infrastructure. We can ask the same question: would you be comfortable riding on this street? But again, we are asking them to guess at how they would feel on a street that maybe they've never experienced in person. So still some difficulty there. So what we're trying to do with this third phase is to actually test how people feel in different types of infrastructure. So our city is building an immersive simulation of bike infrastructure. And then we'll invite people in to ride on a stationary bike in their lab with a VR headset on, and they'll be able to experience some different types of infrastructure on a street in their own town. And then we can ask them, well, what did you think? We can watch where they go. Do they use the infrastructure? We can monitor their heartbeats. Say, are they feeling stressed about where they are? And we can ask them, what did you think about that particular place? So it's a way for us to sort of verify this four types of cyclists framework, and just see, is what we think their attitudes and what they think their attitudes are, does that actually match up with how they behave in a semi-real world? And I should say, the ideal for this would be to actually take people out on bicycles and ride around on different types of infrastructure. But that's hard in places where this infrastructure doesn't exist yet. So this is kind of an interim step. And so we're working with Penrith Council and Wollongong Council on this project. And so to make it as kind of realistic as possible, we went out with a 360 camera and on a helmet-mounted camera, and actually shot these streets, so that when the team from our city builds this simulation, they can actually build an actual roadway from Wollongong or from Penrith, and they can model the amount of traffic that's there, the land uses, the urban design, the street conditions, all that kind of stuff. And as a bonus, no magpies swooped me at all when I was wearing that camera. So, I'm just going to wear that all the time now. And this is they're just in the process of starting to build these simulations. So I don't have any pictures of the actual simulations that they're going to do for this, but these are just some examples of previous work that they've done, the kinds of environments that they can model in here. And as you saw, Hao and I and Mike Harris, who's our CI on this project, get to go experience kind of a very early prototype of this, and it is, it's very interesting to be in these virtual environments. But and hopefully, by the time we're ready to invite people in, we have an environment that really looks and feels at least close enough to reality that we can get some good data from them. And as I said, we're a third of the way through this process. We've got another 1.5 years to go or so on this. So hopefully we'll be able to come back in a year or so and share some real results with you. And that is it. So thanks. We'll take questions or. Can you stop sharing maybe?
Where's the top one from? Do
I
you know?
don't. I just asked if they could send over some examples, and I don't know. I can probably. I might be able to.
Newcastle. I was like, oh.
Oh yeah, it could be. I don't know. Is Julius? Who's going to try to? Oh yeah, Julius. Do you know where that top picture was from?
It's actually created a couple of years ago, so I don't remember the exact location of it, but it's actually somewhere around UNSW, if I'm not wrong.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's somewhere in Randwick, I think.
Great. Thanks. Brian, did you say you had a question for Hal?
Yeah, thanks for reminding me. So how you sort of compare the accessibility of auto and transit, walking and cycling, and the basic assumptions that you have made was kind of in the US, the road infrastructure is more extensive, right, compared to the other countries. Have you also looked at the transit network? Because depending on the shape of transit network, some city has a very strong radial type, centralized, and some cities have a quite extensive grid type of transit network. So just wondering if you have a look at that factor, or if you have any plan to add that kind of parameters in your analysis in the future.
Oh, well, we only use the GTFS data to measure the end result of that transit network, which is the person-weighted accessibility, but we didn't actually look at the shape of the transit network, but I think there's a lot more to be done with that data set, including comparing the transit network, basically producing a network index for that city, and then comparing that index with the end result of person-weighted access. I haven't tried that yet, but that can be a future research direction, including looking at other measures like per capita GDP and other stuff, how to relate to access. Yeah. Does that answer your question? Thank you, Brian.
Yes. Thanks.
I had a question, Lee, with building the simulations. How are you going to factor in, or how's RC going to factor in sort of traffic conditions? Because I would have thought, you know, you're going to have the street and it's going to look photorealistic.
Yeah.
But, you know, whether you've got a lot of heavy vehicle movement occurring or, you know, light vehicle movement, that would likely play into how comfortable people feel.
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know, maybe Julius, you can answer this better than I do. I can. I mean, the ones that I've experienced, I've seen where they model the number of cars, but they tend to not be moving in the simulation, which sort of makes it a little bit not super realistic. So I don't know, Julius, is that something that I mean, will cars move?
Yes. So the simulator platform that we built was actually originally built for driving simulator. So we do have the functionality to program traffic, including how many cars we want to be there and what kind of cars or trucks will be there, for example. So this is definitely something that we can program inside the simulator, but sometimes we want to keep the traffic as little as possible so that participants can better appreciate the design of the infrastructure itself without too much distractions. Yes, this is something that we will discuss in the future of this project, probably. Yeah.
Yeah, and one of the good things is that the two councils that we're working with, Penrith and Wollongong, we chose streets where they had other projects going on, and so they have a fair amount of data collected already in terms of traffic volumes and, you know, traffic patterns throughout the day and number of pedestrians and cyclists already using the street. So that'll help us inform that model, that simulation.
Other question similar to this is basically, is possible to introduce the rain situation or more realistic, because some decisions change in that. And another point is, for example, in wakeability, when the seasons change, for example, Melbourne is different, 33 degrees versus the half. So it's possible to introduce this dimension to.
Yeah, good question. When I went to Wollongong, it was pouring rain. So at least in the 3D video, they have the real conditions. But I'll send that over to you as well, Julius. I don't know the answer to that.
But another user experience question as well for you, Lee.
Okay.
So I would classify myself in that second group of cyclists, confident but not fearless. And one of the things that I find a bit frustrating cycling in Sydney is that there are often cycle routes, I won't call them cycle paths because sometimes they send you up onto the pavement,
Yeah.
which are not efficient at all. And so I find myself switching between the cycle route and the main road, and then back to the cycle route,
Right.
because the main road is much more efficient. But actually switching from the cycle route to the road and back to the cycle route is dangerous because the cars don't expect it.
Yeah.
Is that something that you can model? Because I think that happens a lot. There's shortcuts in cycle routes that are really inefficient. And as a cyclist, I don't want to take the route which may send me up onto a pavement and round the back streets and back to where I started.
That's a good question. And I should say that was probably the thing that we identified as the aspect of the current New South Wales policy on cycling that is probably not keeping up with global best practice is the reliance on shared paths in New South Wales. That, you know, we still I mean, it's an okay interim solution. You know, we need to at least make it legal to cycle from one place to another, and you know, safer than riding on a 60-kilometer-an-hour road. So oftentimes we build a shared path as an interim solution, but they're terrible, right? I mean, there's really no, unless you're in a place with very low volumes of both cyclists and pedestrians, it's a bad environment for everybody.
So my commute from home to here, for example, is a separated path with a turn onto another road with a separated path, but the bike route is over the corner of the pedestrian corner. So I always go into the road and turn at the road and then go back into the route. But
that's that whole
nice
interview.
to model those as kind of best practice experiences.
That's true. And it reminds me that I was just Bicycle Network, which is a big, well, they're based in Victoria, but now they're sort of have a national footprint as a bike advocacy group. But they do a lot of counting bicycle counts, and they've just sort of rolled out a new tool that lets them, it uses video recording to trace where every user goes in a piece of infrastructure. So they can watch, you know, does a cyclist go up on the footpath or jump down into the main road, and where does that happen, and you know, is that typical practice? And I think that's really good data to have, because you know, oftentimes we don't, as planners, we don't have that fine-grained detail about, you know, how does somebody actually use this piece, you know, unless the planner is a cyclist and they ride it themselves. I don't know if that may be kind of version 2 of the simulation, that we can model that kind of ability to ride up on footpaths and just see where people go. But I think that sort of echoes the point of the intersection being usually the place where bike infrastructure falls apart, because it's tough and it's expensive to deal with, and you know, there are multiple, you know, everyone's coming into the same space, and we have to figure out how to share it with cars and everybody else. And so it is, I mean, that's a very, it's not just your commute, it's like, that's everybody's bike experiences, that they have to ride up on the footpath sometimes, and it sucks. I don't know, well, Julius, I don't know if you want to address that at all, whether that's possible in the modeling.
That's definitely something that we can model in the simulator, but I think for this project we will create a separate scenarios for each of the infrastructure. I think that's what we planned, originally, but that's definitely something that we can do as a follow-up in the future.
The scope of this particular project is not the intersection is not I don't know how much intersection modeling we're going to actually be able to do. The idea is that we modeled 3 different types of bike infrastructure over a 1 kilometer route, and I guess actually we do have 4-way intersections and roundabouts in there. So there will be some intersection modeling there, but probably not to the degree where a cyclist could choose, you know, to go on any one of the street options. Version 2.
So I guess this would probably be on the scope of your project, but I'm curious if you know if anyone is looking at it, or if it's even being considered in these kinds of studies. I'm very much a part of the far right of the interested but concerned group, in the point where I'm almost at the point of the no way. And the reason for that is I'm a part of what I would call the missing group in the biking opportunity. I missed the opportunity to become a part of bike culture, because when I was young, I grew up in a very bike unfriendly neighborhood. My parents had no time to help me learn how to ride a bike. I had a bike, but everywhere around me was concrete roads and nowhere I could go, so I never really rode it that much. And then now in the later part of my life, I'm interested, but I don't have that years of bike experience. I can ride a bike barely, I have no space to really grow. And even if I go to dedicated biking places, I'm being passed by people way more skilled by me. I feel tense. I go, oh my goodness, how do I become more comfortable? And so I guess the question is how much effort is being put towards what I would call the soft infrastructure of bike learning, of bike being comfortable, in terms of how much is being put into teaching, making sure kids know how to ride bikes?
Yeah.
Than much less adults and older people.
Yeah.
And if those spaces exist to get to the point where they're even comfortable enough to even think of starting to use these hard infrastructure things that are, so much effort is being put towards. And so that's my question.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And it sort of goes back to, I mean, it is out of the scope of this project because it's just infrastructure related. But, you know, if you look at a robust bicycle promotion program, it includes a lot of that training, both in schools, but also for adults. I mean, actually, you can do that here. You can take a bike training course on campus here you know, will teach you sort of bicycle skills.
That's knowledge to me, so that's
yeah,
great to even know it exists.
It's they promoted it. They did a lot of promotion around it a couple months ago, but I don't know how often they run them. I think they run them fairly often, but it's one of those things where, you know, just getting the messaging out that bicycling is even just that it's okay to do, you know, is actually something that we're not very good at yet, right? I mean, even though councils all say, yeah, we want to promote cycling, yeah, we want to do all these things, just the messaging that we get every day is not that, you know, it's all car oriented, you know, and so a robust bike training program would include, you know, bringing teachers to school to teach cycling skills to primary schools, to creating safe routes to school so that it is comfortable for people to ride bikes to school, you know, where parents can say, yeah, I feel safe about my kid riding to school, to, you know, end of trip facilities in every building, you know, saying, okay, here's a place to park your bike that's safe, you know, here's a place to change your clothes and take a shower, and, you know, all those things that we want to do when we get to the end of a ride and we're sweaty and we have to go to work, to doing that kind of training stuff. So, yeah, I mean, there is a whole range of stuff that, yeah, definitely not in the scope.
Not in the scope, but I was just curious how much you'd heard about it.
It is really a key piece, yeah, and that behavior change piece is, I mean, that's a giant task, but it's actually something that councils and governments are really good at doing in general. I mean, if you look at, you know, wearing seatbelts. I mean, in my lifetime, and maybe everybody else's, that was a complete change from me as a kid. You know, we'd wander around in the car while I was driving to, no, everyone sits in the seat with a seatbelt on, and your kid is in a child seat until they're 12 or whatever. You know, we do change our behaviors, even, you know, but it does take a concerted effort and money and all that stuff. Yeah. I guess we're at 5 o'clock, but I don't know, I'm not going anywhere. Any last questions from online, or?
I had a more technical one for Hal.
Yeah.
With your like transit network modeling, what time of day are you using for that?
So we're using 8 a.m. local time for every city. So basically that's a pretty standard practice. For US cities, it's a 7 a.m. to 9 a.m. minutely average.
Okay.
It smooths out fluctuations at specific places. Yeah. Thank you.
Good. I think I have the chat open correctly. It doesn't look like there's anything in online chat. So I don't know, should we stop there? Thanks very much for coming. I think our first presentations to real people in person, and I don't know, for me, it's been at least a year. So. Oh, great. Yeah, so Nigel's asking, I don't know if you guys can see this, but he's asking, will you be monitoring physiological indicators of stress, anxiety, like heart rate, which could help to quantify comfort levels? Yeah, so that's something that we've been talking with our city group about. They have I don't even know what you call it, something you put on your head that monitors like galvanic skin response and heart rate and all that kind of stuff. They do have that capacity, and so, you know, I think as the simulator gets built up, we'll see, you know, what's actually reasonable to integrate into that. But I think it's a really key thing to be able to, I mean, even if it's just heart rate, that's a great bit of data on how stressful an environment feels. So yeah, great question, Nigel. Great. Well, thanks everybody for coming. And I don't know when the next one is, in two weeks?
So.
Great. Thanks.